Boa tarde a todos. Muito obrigada pela vossa presença neste webinar sobre o tratamento e prevenção do tromboembolismo venoso nos doentes com Covid-19. Antes de começarmos, gostava de agradecer à Sociedade Portuguesa de Medicina Interna por desafiar o Núcleo de Estudos de Doença Vascular Pulmonar, do qual sou coordenadora, a debater este tema em público e com palestrantes muito interessantes, e sobretudo também à ROVI pelo apoio nesta iniciativa. Os dois palestrantes de hoje são a doutora Melanie Ferreira. Ela é membro do secretariado do Núcleo de Estudos de Doença Vascular Pulmonar, é assistente hospitalar de medicina interna do Hospital Garcia da Horta e é co-coordenadora da consulta de tromboembolismo venoso deste hospital. O último palestrante is David Jimenez. He is an associated clinical professor of medicine in Alcalá Henares University and the head of the respiratory department in Ramón Cajal Hospital. His main interest is venous thromboembolism. He is the co-author of the 2019 ESC guidelines on the diagnosis and management of acute pulmonary embolism, and we are very glad to have him here with us. We are going to start first by Dr. Melanie, and so the screen is yours, Melanie. Thank you for your presence here.
Obrigado eu, Carolina, e portanto vou passar a minha apresentação, que vai falar sobretudo sobre a profilaxia e o tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso em doentes com Covid-19 e o que sabemos à data. Não estou a conseguir. Ok, pronto, isto são as minhas declarações de conflitos de interesse. E, portanto, como todos sabemos, em meados de dezembro de 2019 começaram a aparecer os primeiros relatos de uma nova pneumonia associada ao novo coronavírus. E desde então, se formos fazer uma pequena pesquisa, uma rápida pesquisa no PubMed sobre Covid-19, vemos que desde do início de 2020 já temos cerca de 30 mil artigos publicados sobre a Covid-19. E só para terem uma noção, se pesquisarmos por hipertensão arterial, vamos ter cerca de 14 mil artigos publicados desde o início do ano, HIV cerca de 9 mil e tromboembolismo venoso cerca de 1.500. E, portanto, este tema, de facto, tem dominado as publicações médicas desde o início do ano. Em meados de fevereiro já começaram a aparecer alguns relatos sobre as alterações do equilíbrio de hemostase associados a esta nova pneumonia e este novo coronavírus. E desde então já temos mais alguns dados, nomeadamente sobre a prevalência do tromboembolismo venoso em doentes hospitalizados com Covid-19, sendo que está descrito TVP variando entre os 25% e os 46%, dependendo, como é óbvio, das séries, e a embolia pulmonar de 20% a 42%. Também já vários autores têm definido e têm descrito 3 momentos de risco tromboembólico nestes doentes, nomeadamente no doente em ambulatório, considerado um momento de baixo risco para o tromboembolismo venoso, em que os eventos são sobretudo associados à imobilização e ao confinamento, que às vezes é num espaço bastante pequeno. Em relação ao segundo momento, é o momento da hospitalização, e estes doentes são de elevado risco para o tromboembolismo venoso, em que o tromboembolismo venoso aqui está sobretudo associado à doença aguda, à hospitalização, sobretudo em unidades de cuidados intermédios e cuidados intensivos. E o terceiro e último momento é o momento pós-alta, que se associa ao risco intermédio do evento tromboembólico venoso, sobretudo associado ao período após-hospitalização, um período de rescaldo e também em que alguns doentes mantêm algum grau de imobilização conforme vão recuperando de internamentos que muitas vezes são bastante prolongados. Estes estes períodos de risco tromboembólico venoso depois assentam ainda sobre fatores de risco inerente ao doente. E, portanto, nos últimos 2 meses tem sido feito um grande esforço por parte das principais grupos e sociedades internacionais viradas para a anticoagulação e o tromboembolismo venoso para tentar conciliar todos os dados que temos até à data, tornando estes dados, estas evidências, ou estas pequenas casuísticas e séries que têm sido publicado, alguma experiência clínica e alguns protocolos locais em unidades de referência, compilando isto tudo em recomendações e guidelines para melhor nos orientar e orientar estes doentes. O Núcleo de Estudos da Doença Vascular Pulmonar também publicou no final de maio 14 recomendações para a prevenção e o tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso em doentes com Covid-19. E é sobre essas recomendações que eu vou debater e que vou apresentar nos próximos slides. Em relação, começando com a profilaxia do evento tromboembólico venoso no doente Covid-19, aqui não vou enumerar todas as nossas recomendações, foram escolhidas as que nós achamos as mais importantes e, se calhar, as mais prevalentes questões que aparecem nestes doentes. E, portanto, a nossa primeira recomendação é que recomendamos a tromboprofilaxia farmacológica a todos os doentes com Covid-19 admitidos em internamento hospitalar na ausência de contraindicações absoluta. E esta recomendação é concordante também com as recomendações do American College of Chest Physicians e do ISTH, e aqui com alguma preferência para a heparina de baixo peso molecular, sobretudo pela facilidade da administração a ela associada. Esta recomendação baseia-se sobretudo pelo conhecimento que já temos de que a Covid-19 apresenta vários fatores de risco para o tromboembolismo venoso, nomeadamente a doença aguda, o internamento em cuidados intensivos ou intermédios, a disfunção multiorgânica, muitas vezes é ela associada, e depois ainda uma resposta inflamatória e uma disfunção endotelial muito exuberante e muito pró-trombótica. Estes fatores de risco e estes fenómenos vão levar a alterações do equilíbrio hemostático do doente e que depois pode levar e comatando em eventos trombóticos, tanto venosos, arteriais ou mesmo coagulação intravascular disseminada. Em relação à nossa terceira recomendação, sugerimos considerar aumentar a dose profilática por uma dose intermédia em alguns doentes admitidos nos cuidados intermédios ou intensivos. E esta recomendação é concordante com também as recomendações do ISTH, sobretudo em doentes obesos, sendo que também aqui eles não recomendam o uso de uma dose terapêutica de anticoagulação para profilaxia primária. O American College of Chest Physicians é um pouco mais conservadora nesta recomendação, recomendando apenas a dose standard, e isto porque por eles não existe ainda evidência robusta que estes doentes acarretam o risco tromboembólico venoso superior a um doente internado com outra doença aguda, e também não sabemos ainda ao certo qual é que é o perfil hemorrágico destes doentes. Fazem uma observação que no futuro próximo, se existir eventuais novas indicações e nova evidência, eventualmente esta poderá vir a ser considerada, mas para já não é uma recomendação deles. O que está por trás desta recomendação é que têm sido descritos vários eventos tromboembólicos venosos, mesmo com profilaxia farmacológica standard, que consideramos como breakthrough clots, e como a título de exemplo, numa série de 168 doentes na Holanda, internados em unidade de cuidados intensivos e submetidos a profilaxia farmacológica standard segundo o protocolo local, 27% destes doentes desenvolveram um evento tromboembólico venoso agudo. E esta não é a única série a reportar estes fenómenos, e daí alguns experts e alguns autores defenderem a intensificação da profilaxia farmacológica primária nestes doentes. Em relação à nossa sexta recomendação, em que sugerimos estender a profilaxia até um máximo de 30 a 45 dias nos doentes com risco elevado de tromboembolismo venoso e baixo risco hemorrágico, quando alta para o domicílio. Mais uma vez, esta recomendação é concordante com as recomendações também do ISTH, em que eles até recomendam considerar estender a profilaxia primária farmacológica a todos os doentes que foram hospitalizados para Covid-19, que entendemos que tenham um risco de tromboembolismo elevado. Enquanto que, mais uma vez, o American College of Chest Physicians, nas suas recomendações, nas suas guidelines, não fazem esta recomendação, recomendando apenas profilaxia farmacológica em ambiente hospitalar e, mais uma vez, isto deve-se ao facto de não existir até à data dados robustos, evidência robusta sobre o risco tromboembólico venoso deste doente e também o risco e o perfil hemorrágico destes doentes, também observando que no futuro próximo, com eventuais ensaios clínicos, com os seus resultados, que eventualmente poderá ser considerado dependendo dos resultados desses ensaios clínicos a decorrer. O que está por trás desta recomendação tem a ver com o risco de tromboembolismo venoso após alta hospitalar, em que sabemos que se estende até às 3 a 6 semanas após o internamento, sendo superior nas primeiras 3 semanas. E já vários ensaios clínicos nos últimos anos têm tentado demonstrar e selecionar doentes que irão beneficiar da profilaxia primária farmacológica após internamento. Contudo, todos eles tiveram alguma dificuldade em atingir os seus endpoints primários em termos de eficácia e em termos de segurança. Contudo, em análise pós-hoc, foi determinado que um subgrupo de doentes com muito elevado risco trombótico após a alta, nomeadamente recorrendo, por exemplo, ao score Improve modificado, poderão ser candidatos e poderão beneficiar de profilaxia primária farmacológica após a alta. E há alguns autores e alguns experts que também recomendam usar estes mesmos scores para avaliar possíveis candidatos em doentes com Covid-19 que também tiveram internados. Em relação à nossa recomendação 7, em que sugerimos instituir tromboprofilaxia farmacológica em doentes com Covid-19 ligeiro, tratados em ambulatório, com mobilidade reduzida, e ou tromboembolismo venoso prévio, ou doença oncológica, ou cirurgia prévia recente, esta recomendação e este grupo de doentes não são abordados nas recomendações do American College of Chest Physicians nem no ISTH, contudo, o American Society of Hematology deixa à consideração do clínico e recomenda que seja considerado caso a caso esta atitude nos doentes que de facto estão internados ou que estão em casa com Covid-19. Nós optamos por incluir esta linha nas nossas recomendações, sobretudo pela forte aposta que tem sido feita em Portugal, como por exemplo a hospitalização domiciliária, que eventualmente serão doentes em que esta tromboprofilaxia se aplicará. Em relação ao diagnóstico e tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso, aqui as principais recomendações, no fundo, extrapolam o que existe para o tratamento e diagnóstico de tromboembolismo venoso em doentes não Covid-19, com algumas observações e algumas premissas, sobretudo devido à dificuldade logística e aos recursos necessários para, por vezes, levar estes doentes a ataque ou realizar outros exames complementares de diagnóstico ou mesmo na administração de terapêuticas. E, portanto, passando já à nossa segunda recomendação do diagnóstico e tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso em doentes com Covid-19, sugerimos que o diagnóstico presuntivo de tromboembolismo venoso com início imediato da terapêutica adequada à gravidade clínica perante a impossibilidade de realização de exame de imagem imagem que confirma a suspeita de tromboembolismo venoso no doente Covid-19 e com baixo risco hemorrágico. Esta recomendação não é também muito concordante com o que com o que são as recomendações do ISTH nem do American College of Chest Physicians. É assim descrito por outros grupos, nomeadamente o Anticoagulation Forum e o British Thoracic Society, e sobretudo deve-se ao facto de muitas vezes ser difícil levar estes doentes a um ataque em tempo útil, de ser difícil realizar, por exemplo, um ecocardiograma à cabeceira em um doente em prone, ou mesmo realizar um ecodoppler para confirmar ou não a presença de TVP. Em relação à nossa terceira recomendação, nós recomendamos que as principais recomendações para o tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso devem ser seguidas em doentes com Covid-19. E aqui, com preferência para terapêutica anticoagulante parentérica nos doentes em que o quadro clínico justifique internamento. Aqui, esta recomendação é concordante com as recomendações do American College of Chest Physicians e do ISTH, e deve-se sobretudo a preferência pelo terapêutica anticoagulante parentérica, deve-se sobretudo às possíveis interações dos DOACs com outros fármacos frequentemente usados nestes doentes, nomeadamente os antivirais, os antibióticos e os corticoides, e ainda a facilidade em interromper a anticoagulação parentérica para eventual procedimentos invasivos, que também são muito frequentes nestes doentes, sendo que aqui, que é a de baixo peso molecular, tem ainda outra vantagem, que é minimiza o número de contactos com o doente, nomeadamente para trocas de seringas e para colheitas de sangue para determinação de APTT. Em relação à nossa quarta recomendação, recomendamos que a terapêutica trombolítica sistémica seja reservada para casos confirmados ou de suspeita elevada de embolia pulmonar de alto risco. Aqui, por exemplo, o ISTH não menciona especificamente como tratar estes doentes, remetem para as guidelines já existentes e recentes para o tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso. Aqui o American College of Chest Physicians, esse sim, dizem taxativamente que não é recomendado trombólise sistémica em doentes que não apresentam hipotensão, que definem como uma tensão arterial sistólica abaixo dos 90 mm de mercúrio, ou uma descida da tensão arterial superior ou igual a 40 mm de mercúrio durante mais de 15 minutos. Eles vão ainda um pouco mais além, para além de admitirem trombólise em doentes que apresentam estas características e que apresentam esta hipotensão arterial, vão ainda além e selecionam outro subgrupo de doentes que eventualmente candidatos a trombólise sistémica, que são doentes que, embora não apresentam se não apresentam com hipotensão arterial, que venham a desenvolver sinais de instabilidade hemodinâmica, nomeadamente de choque, mesmo com anticoagulação em curso. Em relação às nossas últimas recomendações, recomendamos privilegiar o uso de anticoagulantes orais diretos ou heparina de baixo peso molecular na ausência de contraindicações como profilaxia secundária do tromboembolismo venoso, e essa deve ser feita e mantida durante pelo menos 3 meses. E isto também é concordante na maioria das guidelines e recomendações publicadas, nomeadamente no American College of Chest Physicians e no ISTH. Aqui o raciocínio por detrás do uso ou da preferência pelos DOACs, ou mesmo a heparina de baixo peso molecular, tem a ver com a diminuição dos contactos com cuidados de saúde para, por exemplo, determinação de INR em relação em doentes anticoagulados com antagonistas de vitamina K. Os 3 meses de anticoagulação deve-se ao facto de considerar que os eventos tromboembólicos venosos associados à infecção ou à Covid-19 é um evento provocado e, portanto, esses doentes devem ser submetidos ao o que é standard of care, são 3 meses de anticoagulação, contudo, eu acho que deve-se ter algum cuidado, porque não sabemos ainda qual é que vai ser a evolução crónica desta doença e, portanto, ao final dos 3 meses, estes doentes devem ser reavaliados por eventuais sequelas da Covid-19 que possam eventualmente justificar a continuação da estratégia da profilaxia secundária do evento tromboembólico venoso. Como eu disse, muitas destas recomendações baseiam-se em pequenas séries, casuísticas, experiências próprias e protocolos instituídos em unidades de referência. Existem registros em cursos sobre a Covid-19 e a doença tromboembólica venosa e também existem ensaios clínicos a decorrer ou a começar, nomeadamente relacionados com a intensidade da profilaxia primária farmacológica e a extensão da profilaxia farmacológica após a alta hospitalar nestes doentes. Em relação às mensagens finais que eu queria deixar aqui, era que a tromboprofilaxia é de facto a melhor ferramenta para prevenir complicações trombóticas associadas à Covid-19. A tromboprofilaxia farmacológica com heparina de baixo peso molecular ou heparina não fracionada em dose standard continua a ser a mais consensual à data e são necessários estudos randomizados para avaliar a eficácia e segurança da profilaxia com dose intermédia e também da extensão da profilaxia em ambulatório em doentes com Covid-19. Em relação ao tratamento e ao diagnóstico de embolia pulmonar, aqui, dada a prevalência significativa de embolia pulmonar em doentes críticos, na impossibilidade de confirmar imagiologicamente em doentes com baixo risco hemorrágico, deve-se abordar o caso como diagnóstico de embolia pulmonar presuntivo, sobretudo em doentes que apresentam descompensação hemodinâmica de novo, sem outra causa aparente. Contudo, devemos privilegiar nestes doentes exames de imagem à cabeceira, nomeadamente um ecocardiograma ou um ecodoppler dos membros inferiores. O tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso em doentes com Covid-19 deve seguir as recomendações específicas e atuais para o tratamento do tromboembolismo venoso em doentes sem Covid-19, sendo que em doentes internados devemos optar e preferir a anticoagulação panentérica, dado as possíveis interações farmacológicas e também, nomeadamente a heparina baixo peso molecular, por diminuir o contacto com o doente. Em ambulatório, também privilegiar a anticoagulação com o DOAC ou a heparina baixo peso molecular, mais uma vez diminuindo a necessidade de contacto com cuidados hospitalares, com uma duração mínima de 3 meses e depois reavaliar. E pronto. Terminei. Carolina, passo a palavra a ti.
Obrigada, Melanie, pela tua excelente apresentação. Fostes clara e concisa e no ponto. Muito, muito obrigada. And now I will pass the word for our last speaker, Professor Jimenez. Thank you once again for being here with us. Doing these presentations that we are very curious about. Thank you. So questions for our speakers, we are going to do it on the end of the 2 presentations. So keep it coming. We are anxious for answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. This is my disclosure slide, and it is funny because early this year, I needed 2 slides for my disclosures. Now I need just 1 slide. And I anticipate at the beginning 2021, I won't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. And I would like to start with my conclusions, so you can then relax, stretch your legs, or even take a nap. Then I will substantiate my conclusions, and at the end, I will wake you up to repeat my conclusions again. In my opinion, we miss high-quality data regarding the risk of thrombosis and the risk of bleeding among COVID-19 patients. And sorry for that. I'm experiencing some technical problems. Let me check. Okay, that's good. For this reason, I strongly recommend to enroll patients with COVID-19 in the randomized controlled trials, testing and evaluating different thromboprophylaxis strategies. According to the data that we have so far, we should have a very low p-test threshold, particularly in those patients with COVID-19 who experience respiratory and hemodynamic collapse. And generally speaking, I will say that we should follow the very same diagnostic and therapeutic strategies as for non-COVID patients with suspicion or confirmed pulmonary embolism. But there is also good news, and there is also some things that we know after these months with the pandemic. The first one is that we know that COVID-19 is associated with a hypercoagulable state. And we know that D dimers are elevated among patients with COVID-19. We know that there is also elevation of fibrinogen, and we know there is mild thrombocytopenia in a good proportion of patients with COVID-19, particularly those who are admitted to the hospital. And we know that COVID-19 is associated with microthrombosis or with local thrombosis in the lungs. And there are some reasons to explain this microthrombosis. Number one, the profound hypoxia in the lungs of patients with COVID-19, particularly those who are critically ill. And number two, the hyperinflammatory state in most of these patients, particularly if they are admitted to the ICU. But also there is microthrombosis or risk of venous thromboembolism, deep vein thrombosis, and or pulmonary embolism among COVID-19 patients. And these patients have, sure, the very same risk factors as other infections for developing microthrombosis, venous thromboembolism. They are usually elderly patients. They have an acute infection. They have a profound inflammatory state. Respiratory failure is almost universal among COVID-19 patients who are admitted to the hospital. Most of them are immobilized, and some of them have some underlying risk factors, such as obesity or history of venous thromboembolism. So the main controversy, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, is if this risk of venous thromboembolism was higher for COVID-19 patients as compared to other patients who experience infectious disease, for instance, flu or bacterial pneumonia or whatever. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we have some very scary cohort studies showing high incidences of venous thromboembolism among COVID-19 patients who require hospital admission, particularly those requiring admission to the intensive care unit. And this is the reason why we perform a systematic review and meta-analysis to assess the true incidence of among these patients. And these are the results of this systematic review and meta-analysis. We are updating this meta-analysis now, but you can see that we differentiated between those patients with COVID-19 who were admitted to the ward and those patients with COVID-19 who were admitted to the intensive care unit. For those patients admitted to the ward, the incidence of deep vein thrombosis, the left side of the slide, was 1%. And for those patients admitted to the ward, the incidence of pulmonary embolism, the right side of the slide, was 2%. And in my humble mind, these numbers compare very well with the results of the landmark randomized controlled trials with pharmacological thromboprophylaxis in patients acutely ill who require hospital admission. I refer to the Medinox, to the PREVENT, or to the Artemis trials. And these trials show that the incidence of venous thromboembolism in the placebo arm was around 2.5 to 5%. So it doesn't seem that COVID-19 is associated with an increased risk for venous thromboembolism when receiving a standard thromboprophylaxis, at least when these patients are admitted to the ward. And what happens to the most severely ill patients with COVID-19, with those patients who are admitted to the intensive care unit? And these are the results of our systematic review and meta-analysis. And you can see that the incidence of pulmonary embolism was 11.6%. And again, it is not much different of the results that we have from previous randomized controlled trials evaluating the efficacy and safety of pharmacological thromboprophylaxis in patients admitted to intensive care units. But in my opinion, if we want to use this data to modify the standard recommendations for thromboprophylaxis, I mean, using standard dose or low dose thromboprophylaxis, it is very important to know the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is the risk of bleeding. And there is lack of good data showing which is the true incidence of major bleeding among patients with COVID-19 receiving a standard thromboprophylaxis, intermediate risk thromboprophylaxis, or even therapeutic anticoagulation. We have this very recent prospective cohort study. This is the Boston experience. And you can see that in the Boston experience, a very well conducted study in 144 critically ill patients, the VT event rate for this population receiving a standard dose thromboprophylaxis was 7.6%. But most important, in my opinion, the most important piece of information coming from this study is that the major bleeding event rate with a standard dose thromboprophylaxis was almost 6%. So my bottom line is that we should be very cautious when recommended increased dose of thromboprophylaxis or even therapeutic anticoagulation until we have the results of the randomized control trials, 20 ongoing randomized control trials at this point in the world. Regarding diagnosis of pulmonary embolism among patients with COVID-19 who require hospitalization, this is my most important principle. And my most important principle is that seeing a clot makes me feel good about treating a clot. And in my opinion, we should follow the very same recommendations provided by international guidelines for diagnosing pulmonary embolism in non-COVID-19 patients. And in this sense, I will stick to the recommendations provided by the European Society of Cardiology guidelines. They were published in the European Respiratory Journal in 2019 and in the European Heart Journal the same year. And this is the strategy for diagnosing pulmonary embolism in stable patients with suspicion of pulmonary embolism. So the first step, you know it very well, is to assess clinical probability. Most of the times with a very well validated prediction rule, such as the Wells score or the Geneva score or the PERC rule or whatever. For those patients with low or intermediate clinical probability, the suggestion is to perform D-dimer testing. And if D-dimer testing is negative, then we can be confident that this patient does not have pulmonary embolism. For those patients with low or intermediate clinical probability and a positive D-dimer testing, or for those patients with a high clinical probability of pulmonary embolism, then the recommendation is an imaging testing. Most of the times, CT angiograms, and CT angiograms are quite sensitive and specific for the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism, meaning that if they are negative, there is no P, and if they are positive, these patients should be anticoagulated unless there is an absolute contraindication for anticoagulation. And these are the European Society of Cardiology recommendations for diagnosing pulmonary embolism in unstable patients with suspected pulmonary embolism. First, they recommend to perform a bedside transthoracic echocardiography. If there is no right ventricular dysfunction in transthoracic echocardiography, then there is no pulmonary embolism. In other words, the sensitivity and the negative predictive values of these tests is almost perfect for unstable patients with suspicion of pulmonary embolism. And for those patients with right ventricular dysfunction, since this test is not so specific and there is availability, the guides recommend to perform CT pulmonary angiogram. And in my opinion, to stick and to adhere to this strategy is particularly important for critically ill COVID-19 patients. And the reason is that if we demonstrate or we suspect unstable pulmonary embolism, these patients should receive reperfusion therapies. And reperfusion therapies are associated with a very high risk of bleeding. So I would almost never recommend to use reperfusion therapies in a COVID-19 patients admitted to the ICU without right ventricular dysfunction. The problem comes when you demonstrate right ventricular dysfunction in a COVID-19 patients, because there are different reasons to have right ventricular dysfunction in this population. Number one, pulmonary embolism. Number two, acute respiratory distress syndrome. Number three, overload of fluid or whatever. So for these patients, the decision is more difficult. And for these patients, I believe that a PERT team is ideal to make a consensus recommendation and to drive a treatment strategy for these critically ill patients with right ventricular dysfunction and COVID-19. And I would like to share with you this our experience. This is the experience, and it's going to be published very soon in a very good journal. And what we did was to gather data from 455 patients who developed venous thromboembolism while they were admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. You can see that 310 patients had pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis in the medical ward, 145 in the intensive care unit. It is very interesting because the numbers and the proportions are completely opposed to what we see in clinical practice for non-COVID-19 patients, meaning that more patients had pulmonary embolism, less patients had deep vein thrombosis, and meaning that for those patients with pulmonary embolism, more patients had small clots, meaning subsegmental or segmental clots, as compared to clots in the big arteries, in the main pulmonary arteries, or in the lobar or segmental arteries. There were some differences regarding the baseline characteristics for those patients who had venous thromboembolism admitted in the ward versus in the ICU. Patients admitted in the ICU who developed venous thromboembolism were younger. They were more frequently men and current smokers, and they more frequently had anemia and lymphopenia as compared to those patients who developed venous thromboembolism in the ward. It is interesting that almost every patient that developed deep vein thrombosis and or pulmonary embolism were on prophylaxis, but while 67% of the patients in the ward were receiving a standard dose, meaning low dose, the usual dose of thromboprophylaxis, only 56% of the ICU were receiving this intensity thromboprophylaxis. More patients in the ICU were receiving intermediate dose thromboprophylaxis, 32% versus 21%. And it is very well anticipated that direct oral anticoagulants as a form of thromboprophylaxis were more frequently administered in those patients admitted to the ward as compared to those patients admitted to the intensive care unit. and how were these patients who developed venous thromboembolism treated in these centers participating in the RIETE registry. You can see that most patients, 93% of those in the ward who developed venous thromboembolism received low molecular weight heparin. Significantly higher proportion of patients in the ICU receive unfractionated heparin as compared to those patients in the ward, 17% compared to 1.4%. As it very well anticipated, more patients in the ICU received reperfusion therapy, vasopressors, or were on ECMO. And these are the results for this series of patients with venous thromboembolism and admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. You can see the incidence curves for these patients in the first 10 days after diagnosis of venous thromboembolism. The red line is deep vein thrombosis, the blue line is pulmonary embolism, and this graph represents all-cause mortality. And you can see that we were not able to demonstrate a significant difference in all-cause mortality between those patients who develop deep vein thrombosis as compared to those patients who develop pulmonary embolism. And the reason, or our hypothesis, is that the main reason for these patients with COVID-19 dying is COVID itself. The majority of these patients who died because of COVID, and the influence of developing venous thromboembolism is marginal in terms of death for these patients. And you can see here, and it was very well anticipated, that those patients in the intensive care unit who developed venous thromboembolism had a significant increased risk for short-term all-cause mortality as compared to those patients who developed venous thromboembolism in the ward. Again, these results might be driven by COVID-19 itself and not by venous thromboembolism. And this is a very interesting slide because we try to dissect which was the population with a highest risk of dying after developing venous thromboembolism. And you can see that the risk of dying in patients with COVID-19 admitted to the hospital who developed venous thromboembolism was negligible in those patients who were younger than 50 years, and the risk of dying significantly increased as the age goes up. And it is very high in those patients who are older than 70 years. So in conclusion, I will say that we still need high quality data on the risk of bleeding and thrombosis for our patients. And since the incidence of COVID-19 is decreasing, at least in our hospital, at least in Spain, I will say that we should have our randomized control trials polished and ready to restart if there is another wave of the pandemic, at least to evaluate the benefits and the risks for intermediate dose thromboprophylaxis. And please have a very low threshold for suspicion of pulmonary embolism among your COVID-19 patients, and use, in general terms, the same diagnostic and therapeutic strategies as for non-COVID patients. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your excellent presentation and for your data on the RIETE registry. And there was very, very, very nice. So I have a few questions for both of you. So I will start with Melanie. Do you think that what do you think that will be the criteria for outpatient thromboprophylaxis in the, now that we don't have many clinical trials on this, and especially on COVID-19 patients?
Well, Similar to what Professor David mentioned, I feel that we should treat for now until we have robust data from the randomized control trials ongoing, that we should treat these patients like other VTE patients or like other acute hospitalized patients. So I would not I think that we should, if we consider extending prophylaxis after hospitalization, then eventually using the improve score, the modified improve score, but in very, to determine very high risk patients, but we have to make sure that they're also very low risk for bleeding.
So do you agree, Professor Jimenez, with this intake?
Absolutely. If the question deals with extended thromboprophylaxis, you know very well that for non-COVID-19 patients, there is an equipoise related to the risk and benefits of extending thromboprophylaxis for the vast majority of acutely ill medical patients who are discharged from hospitals. And this is the reason why guidelines do not recommend extended thromboprophylaxis for the vast majority of these patients. Our practice during the pandemic was that we didn't usually recommend extended thromboprophylaxis except for those patients with additional risk factors at the time of hospital discharge. For instance, we were discharging some patients who remain in bed, who were immobilized at the time of hospital discharge, who were obese, and for these patients we prolonged thromboprophylaxis for a couple of weeks. We didn't use D-dimer levels to drive decisions regarding extended thromboprophylaxis, and the reason is that if we had used D-dimer levels, then 100% of the patients should have received extended thromboprophylaxis. So our practice, to make the story short, was only extend thromboprophylaxis for patients who are discharged with additional risk factors for venous thromboembolism.
So you mentioned D-dimers, and that's another good question for diagnosis. So do you feel like the cutoff of D-dimers that we have currently for non-COVID patients should be applied to the clinical algorithm to the diagnosis of PE or DVT?
Well, I still think that we should adhere. We should be doing individualized medicine. We know that for sure, and we can agree on that. But in general terms, I will recommend to stick to the common strategies. It is true that at the end of the day, most of these patients will have a positive D-dimer, and most of these patients will have to receive an imaging testing. But please take into account that the use of D-dimer in the algorithms for diagnosing pulmonary embolism is to avoid imaging testing. But we were doing ward medicine. So in my opinion, it is not a bad policy that these patients with COVID-19 and a suspicion of pulmonary embolism receive CT angiograms. In fact, most of these patients were receiving CT angiograms because of other reasons, to look better at the lungs, to know better which is the extension of the pneumonia. So most of these patients, if we stick to the D-dimer cutoffs, will receive a CT angiogram, but it is not a major problem, at least in my practice.
So I feel like you like more the screening approach than the standard approach. Do you recommend the screening approach even to DVT? So doing echo Doppler in the veins to all patients in the admissions to the, for example, ICU, and then on day 4, 5, and then 10, do you feel like that this is also a good approach for these patients?
I tend to disagree with that approach. I mean, I said I tend to disagree because we don't have very good and strong data, and the evidence is very weak. But if you mean with screening to test those patients without a suspicion, a clinical suspicion of pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis, then I don't do that in my clinical practice. I still stick to the recommendations for non-COVID-19 patients who recommend against routine screening for patients, particularly for those who are admitted to the ICU. But once said that, I think that we should have a very, very, very low threshold for suspicion of pulmonary embolism, particularly in those patients who are deteriorating, or with those patients who have new signs or symptoms, or for those patients who have some changes in the blood test.
So,
if I could, Carolina, if I could just add to what Professor David just mentioned, he actually just showed interesting data on the fact that most of these patients actually develop PE and don't necessarily have DVT. So if you're just screening for DVT, most of these patients probably won't even develop a DVT. They'll just have what we call in situ thrombosis in the lungs. So screening, DVT screening might not catch most of the VT events that these patients are suffering, because they're mostly, they might be just isolated PE without DVT.
Yes.
Absolutely. Even for non-COVID-19 patients, we have good data published many years ago showing that only 50% of patients with acute symptomatic pulmonary embolism have concomitant residual deep vein thrombosis. So particularly for COVID-19 disease, which is associated with local thrombosis, which might be associated with local thrombosis, then I absolutely agree that at this point, I wouldn't recommend DVT screening for ICU patients.
And my last question for both of you, seeing your data on REIT, what do you feel that should be the dose for low molecular weight for these patients? So should it be standard? Should it be intermediate dose? So you showed some data that even using intermediate dose of low molecular weight heparin, patients have PE and DVT. So what is your opinion on that?
Do you want to start, Melanie?
Well,
up to you.
It's your data. It's your data. It's not my data. My opinion is that I still think that we should wait for the randomized controlled trials. Like you said, we were doing especially in Spain and Italy, and where most of these protocols come from, we're doing wartime medicine. So you don't really know what's best for your patient. You try to do what you think is best. So if you have many patients that develop a DVT on standard dose, I think when you're with another 100 patients that are very similar, you think, well, what if I intensify the dose? Maybe they won't develop. For now, like you said, maybe we have to wait for the randomized controlled trials. And I think that the main point will be, do these patients bleed more or not? I don't know if that answer is already answered.
Well, I really agree with your answer. The short answer, in my opinion, is wait to the randomized control trials. And the standard answer is that even for the guidelines that Melanie saw before, the ISTH does not recommend intermediate dose. They exactly say can also be considered. There can also be considered. They don't even suggest. They can also be considered. And the reason is that we don't have good data in the incidence of venous thromboembolism. We don't know if the risk of venous thromboembolism is higher as compared to pneumococcal pneumonia, for instance. We don't have any data regarding the risk of bleeding for these patients. We don't have good data. And if we concede that COVID-19 is associated with a very exacerbated hypercoagulable state, then why to expect that intermediate dose are going to attenuate or reduce the risk of venous thromboembolism among these patients? We don't know. We don't know. But we know that the higher the dose of anticoagulation, the higher the risk of bleeding. This is one of the certainties in my life. I think that the answer is way to the randomized control trial. In fact, what we have seen in the RIETE registry is that most of these patients, if not all, do very well with anticoagulation once we diagnose venous thromboembolism, and one should expect a higher than usual risk of recurrence even on anticoagulation. I can tell you that the risk of VTE in the first 10 days after anticoagulation in this series of 455 patients was zero, while the risk of bleeding was 3%, major bleeding. So we need more data coming from robust randomized control trials.
I actually, I think it was Dr. Connors in a recent webinar for the subcommittees, the ISTH subcommittees, he actually mentioned another very interesting point, that maybe it's just not anticoagulation and pharmacological thromboprophylaxis, but we also have to look at other strategies to reduce the inflammatory response. And maybe if we also work on that, then maybe we'll also reduce the risk of thrombosis in these patients. So I think that there's still a lot of unanswered questions regarding what is the right strategy to treat these patients and to prevent VTE.
Oh, thank you both for your excellent talks and your answers to all of my questions. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Jimenez and Melanie also. I don't know if you have anything to add on, Melanie and Professor?
From my side, sorry.
No, go ahead.
From my side, only to thank you all. It was very pleased to participate, and thank you for your job, Carolina, for the moderation. Thanks a lot.
Me as well, nothing else to add on. Thank you very much, Professor David, for joining us, and Carolina pela moderação.
Thanks much, Melanie.
So that's it for today, and thank you all for being here with us in this past hour, talking about COVID-19 and VTE is a topic that we all like a lot. So thank you very much, and I will see you soon, I think.